Apple has agreed to start paying about 13 billion euros, that's just under $16 billion, of back taxes to the Irish government in a matter of weeks. Now, this comes in the wake of what the EU competition authorities say were years of sweetheart tax arrangements that essentially amounted to illegal state aid. Even though Dublin and Apple reject the ruling by the EU's competition commissioner, the agreement to start these payments does mark a bit of a watershed in the biggest EU case against the tax practices of American tech companies. Apple's repayments will be held in an escrow account, while the company and the Irish government continue their appeals process at the EU Court of Justice. Now, the EU tax crackdown forced Ireland to rework its business-friendly tax laws quite a bit. Let's get the details on this. Kevin Osbeck joins us now live from Brussels with more data on this story. Kevin, why have Ireland and Apple moved to set up this escrow account now, before even the appeal case has been settled?
Yeah, that's a great question, because both Ireland and Apple are appealing this decision, I should say. That decision from a court won't be coming down the road until many, many months from now. So with both entities appealing this, why would they want to start collecting this money? Well, many analysts believe it's being done to avoid fines that could be imposed by the European Court of Justice. The European Commission was getting a little bit antsy, a little bit upset that this money wasn't being collected by Ireland, so it filed a complaint in the ECJ. The ECJ could potentially fine Ireland if it didn't start taking action on that. So even if the appeal goes the way that Apple and Ireland would like it to, Ireland could always then give this money it's collecting back to Apple.
Indeed. So there's something else that ties into this story, or at least might tie into the story. GDPR rules. Those are coming into effect fairly soon. And we've seen Facebook, another tech titan, making changes to where its users' data is handled in order to avoid having 1.5 billion users who are not in the US and not in Europe falling under those rules. Now, Facebook says this doesn't have any tax implementations, but it's still resident in Ireland. So why is that the case?
Yeah, so this one can be really tricky and really confusing for Facebook users. And how you have to think of this is essentially, in your mind, you have to realize there are two Facebooks, one that's headquartered in California, another one that is headquartered not too far from where I am in Ireland. And previously, this is how it worked. If you had a Facebook account and you lived in either the US or Canada, you signed your terms and conditions with Facebook in California. All the rest of us, whether we live in LATAM, Europe, Africa, Asia, or Australia, we signed our terms and conditions with Facebook in Ireland. Well, at the end of next month, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, this is a huge sweeping list of much tougher EU data protection laws, will go into effect. And what Facebook is doing is making everybody outside of Europe, so now people like you in Nairobi and across the African continent, Latin America and Asia, will have to sign new terms and conditions with Facebook in California. The only people who will be signing terms and conditions with Facebook in Ireland are those of us who live here in the EU. Now, Facebook says it is going to have uniform data protection and setting standards for all users. But here's the difference. Somebody like me who lives in the EU, if I think Facebook has misused or abused my data and did something that is not in line with the GDPR, I could file a complaint with either the Data Regulation Agency here in Belgium or in Ireland, where my terms and conditions are with Facebook. But for you, Nairobi, if you now think that your data has been misused or abused by Facebook, you're going to have to file a complaint now with Facebook in California, and you're going to be subject to the much more lenient data protection laws in America. So there may be uniform Facebook settings and terms and conditions, but the liability will be different depending if you are in or outside the EU.
Indeed, that will be one interesting story to discuss separately or by itself. But one last question for you, Kevin. So the EU Commission today stressing its plan to make EU tech firms competitive, especially in the field of artificial intelligence. But can the EU really compete with these enormous tech titans coming out of Silicon Valley like Google and Facebook and Apple?
Well, the EU sure wants to compete. It wants to make sure EU firms are able to compete here. So the commission says it's going to make sure it will put forward 1.8 billion US dollars in AI investment up until 2020. Now that really pales in comparison to the amount of investment going into AI in both the US and in China. But still though, the EU actually thinks with the GDPR, it could make consumers very confident in EU AI companies because they think their data will be protected. But one huge disadvantage for European AI firms is it's not going to have access to as much data. And many analysts say really having access to a huge pool of data is what advances AI technologies. When you look at the US, which has some 300 million users and much more lax data protection laws, American firms have a leg up there. Chinese firms certainly have a leg up there because data regulation is essentially non-existent there. And you've a consumer base of 1.3 or 1.4 billion people and also a lot of state help. So many would say that the EU is being maybe a little unrealistic, but at least ambitious here. And of course, European AI firms say they'll take any help that they can get.
Indeed. And of course, we should also point out hundreds of millions of people across Africa. Most of these African countries we're talking about also don't have stringent data protection rules in place. We'll leave it there for the time being. Kevin Osbeck in Brussels. Thank you.